Welcome to the Nurturing Fathers Podcast, a show dedicated to helping men succeed at the most challenging and rewarding job they'll ever have, being a dad. Your hosts are Mark Perlman, the creator and founder of the Nurturing Fathers program, and his son, Corey Perlman, who facilitates the program at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary and is also a father of 2 young children. It's time to add tools to your Nurturing Fathers toolbox. Mark and Corey, take it away.
Well, hello, everyone. This is Corey Perlman. I'm here again with my dad, Mark Perlman. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great. Good to be here. Happy to be talking to this young man on the phone with us today.
Yeah, we'll tease it out a little bit so they don't know who he is just yet. We are super excited for today because we have a special guest on the line. We're going to talk a little bit about him and then let him share his story. But I came across this gentleman at your Nurturing Fathers meeting summit a few years ago and loved his energy, had an instant connection. And he gave me, I think actually, I could be wrong on this, but I think I bought the first copy of this book or one of the first copies of this book.
You did, I recall it.
Yeah, and it was an amazing book. It's all about facilitating. So I had just started facilitating the Nurturing Fathers program, and he actually wrote a book on the subject of facilitating. And what was so fascinating to me is he talked about all these different types that are in the room with the group dynamic, and it was absolutely 100% accurate. And so it's just been such an amazing guide for me as I've facilitated more Nurturing Fathers programs. What's your connection with this gentleman?
I've known Haji almost as long as I've been doing this work, which is 20 plus years since Nurturing Fathers was created. Haji shows up in the places that seem to be most important and most relevant at the time for getting this work done. I'm going to let him explain what those places are and what his roles have been. But he's a delightful person, very knowledgeable, very committed to this field and the work that we do. So Haji, to get started, let's just talk a little bit about you and your family, because I know you are a committed and happy married and family man, and that arc of work that you have done over the years that I have tapped into and has been a benefit and generator for Nurturing Fathers. So please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Wow. Well, thank you, gentlemen. It is a pleasure to share space with you electronically like this. So family, 30 years ago, last month, my wife and I got married on top of Mount Washington here in New England. I live in the Massachusetts, Boston area, and we wanted to be as high as possible when we got married. So we climbed a 6,200-foot mountain and exchanged vows to love one another. And our son, our first child, was conceived on our honeymoon down in a diamond mine in Arkansas. We took this kind of spiritual, mystic journey after we got married through some spiritual touch points for us and conceived our first child. It was an amazing experience birthing him and his younger sister. I have a daughter who's 26 now, who's just got on her own insurance, so one of those big milestones. And my oldest is 29 now, has his own insurance and lifestyle. And it's interesting, Mark, because I know you have, 2 adult children as well. And, you always continue to father, but just having this, kind of distance, this space, and seeing them adulting in their own right is really quite fascinating, especially since I'll just say this, that my own father just passed away last month also, like on my birthday on July 11th. And yeah, I met Mark, so I can look at the first few pages of the Nurturing Fathers program, workbooks, and see that they were initially published in 1998. That's correct?
Correct.
So in 1999, I started facilitating that program. So I think not only here in Massachusetts, but maybe around the country, I was one of the first people to get, certified. Certification is part of it, but as you guys know, as everybody knows, as Corey was referencing the book, it's really the doing it. It's being in the groups. And so I had been doing some family support work, crisis intervention, social work with families before that. And one of the things that brought me to facilitating fathers groups is as I was doing this family systems approach, it was really clear that fathers had been left out of this family systems model by the, social service agencies that I was working with. And my kids were, pretty young. In fact, that place in the workbook where you write in the ages of your kids, I held that first workbook through, 20 years of doing groups. And so my kids are 9 years old and 6 years old. And it's just, interesting to look back at all the journeys I had with them. So I was really fortunate to meet this woman, Sharon Shea, who had started the Family Nurturing Center of Massachusetts in the late 80s, early 90s, I'm not sure when, but in 99, she approached me about facilitating this group because what had happened with the family nurturing programs that, Dr. Babla created and were going really strong here in Boston is that the folks that were facilitating them just weren't really able to get men in the circles. So we had this great resource for families, but men just, you had 10, 12, however many parents in a group with their kids, and they were almost 100% moms. So when we started doing the Nurturing Fathers program here in the Boston area in 99, there were some people that were skeptical, like, oh, men aren't going to come to groups. Men don't do groups. And I was, not only had been a social worker for, almost 10 years before that point, I had been, when I look at my own life trajectory, I think that, I had been a personal development junkie. I'd been somebody that wanted to grow and wanted to change. I started practicing, meditation and yoga and, healing work long before it was really mainstream to the extent that it is now. So my social work, my, kind of service to families had always been in that context as well, that I just wanted to create more peace and love in the world, if you will. And it seemed like the family was a great place to start. And since dads were obviously this overlooked element of the family unit, it was just a blessing to be able to work with so many men. And what I recognized really early on from that first group, in fact, is that I wasn't unique in wanting to change and grow as a human being, who embodies a male physique. As men, we're often not given enough, as it talks about in the program, the Nurturing Fathers program, this capacity to look at all our emotional states. In order for us to grow and become more enlightened human beings, we've got to get in touch with our emotions as well as our thoughts. And the Nurturing Fathers program is just a great way to help men do that, because stuff that we want to do for ourselves or for our own parents or for our, partners, spouses, girlfriends, we'll do for our kids. We'll make changes for them in our core, alignments that we might not do in other cases. So fatherhood is just a great opportunity. It's a great growth point, personal development point. So working with men around fatherhood has just been a really just great, avenue for me to help affect change in society.
Wonderful. Thank you, Haji. I'm thinking about creating this program when I did, and you are dating us all because, yes, it's been a long, long time ago. And naming it Nurturing Fathers, I realized, was taking kind of a strategic risk because nurturing and fathering was not naturally put together. Nurturing was squarely on the mom and female side of the ledger. So when I combined it with Nurturing Fathers, I was quite clear that I felt that I had that capacity myself, as I know Haji did as well from listening to him. My son Corey here clearly does, as I watch him father his two children. But it was not mainstream, and it was not. In fact, I got a note from a woman who heard about my program and said, "Thank you, Mr. Perlman, for creating the Nurturing Fathers program." So it gives us some idea of the cultural understanding. Now, I've watched our daughters and our wives come into power in the last 20, 30 years. I like to think that and I know Haji had a support role in that, and that it was something we welcomed and encouraged. I watched Corey's daughter benefit from that, and that she's got this sense of empowerment and she could really do anything in the world. Instead of just becoming maybe a nurse, she could become a doctor and a CEO of a company. But, boys haven't had the exact same influence and opportunity, I don't think, that those little girls have had. So part of me wonders if maybe adding the word nurturing to the fathering role or the role of masculinity will help us grow into our potential and our sons grow into their potential more in the way that the young women and our daughters have. With that in mind, there's a concept called father bias. And it's an interesting term because we as men are more used to being on the privileged side, and society kind of has looked on us in a privileged kind of way. But when it comes to fathering and it comes to parenting, that is not always the case. And the term father bias captures ways in which our society may be prejudiced overtly or subtly against the men in the parenting and fathering role. So Haji, if you will, define father bias for our listeners and maybe give a few examples of how you've seen that.
I think the most culturally relevant example of father bias is Homer Simpson. He's got the longest running television show on network television in U.S. history. And when you look at Homer Simpson and the characteristics that he projects out towards on all men, it's that fumbling, bumbling, kind of he's got a job. He may not be very good at it, but he does have an income. But besides him doing that role, it's his wife, Marge, who kind of holds down the rest of the fort and prevents him from, kind of injuring the kids either intentionally or unintentionally. And I think it's that image of fathers in society that we're pushing back against. And you're right, Mark. I remember, 20 years ago, that idea of that phrase, nurturing father, being an oxymoron. People are like, these two words don't go together. And I'm really happy now to see that people are a lot more accepting of the idea of nurturing father. And I think that the woman who wrote to you, back in the 90s about, neutering father, that's a really significant, Freudian slip, if it in fact was, saying that by, encouraging men to be more, emotional, by being more empathic, by being more compassionate and loving, that it actually does push up against these, Corey had mentioned the archetypes in my book. It pushes up against these traditional male archetypes that say men can only be one way. We can only be the risk-taking, high-flying, danger-courting, Marlboro man. And if you're not being that type of, individual adventurer, you're not really living up to fully what it means to be a man. And we know that men and women both have the capacity. In fact, you have to have some flexibility around how you operate within the world. And certainly, I grew up in the inner city here in Boston, and a man and a woman has to have a certain level of armor up when they go out into the world. But one of the challenges for men is being able to take that armor down, where women, because of their role and how they've been socialized, have been, kind of easier for them to take their armor off when they come into the home, to be that they've been socialized to be more, loving and compassionate. And as they've worked to be more assertive out in the world, there's that complementary dance that we as men have to do, that we come into the home, to be willing to be more, connected, both, physically, which we tend to be better at, playing games or roughhousing and all that stuff, but emotionally as well, to let people know, how we're really feeling, that dad does have an array of emotions. One thing actually that's come up with me, and I don't know that we've actually had the chance, Mark or Corey and I, to have this discussion. There's this rap on men that there's only one emotion. I know there's the 6 emotional, standards that we look at in the Nurturing Fathers program, and that men tend to default towards anger when we start to feel some rise in emotion. And it's not really appropriate for us to feel, sad or even like excited unless we're around a football game or some kind of activity like that. But the other emotion that men are allowed to default to in our society that we don't even talk about that much is lust. And that's another emotion that drives our world. So lust and anger of things that actually always come up in, when we're doing in groups. I've done other groups with men as well, too, where, anger is something that certainly we have to work on. And looking at how lust affects our lives as well, too, is something that I've been really curious about. Obviously, you don't generally get to be a father unless there's some element of lust that you're working around. And just like anger is not all bad, neither is lust all bad. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying that we need to be aware of how all these emotions come up in our lives and how we can use them. So I think that, giving men the opportunity to come together in a circle and realize they're not the only ones that can feel fear. For instance, we talk about fear in the group, and guys, some men will come in with this attitude like, I'm not afraid of anything. And it's like, are you afraid your kids might get hurt? Well, yeah, I'm afraid of that. Well, that's a fear. Let's own that, And some great conversations, some of the best conversations of my life have come up during those, evenings when I've been having a group and we've been able to talk about these deep well of feelings that come up around partners and children and friends that we develop in the group. And it's just so special to watch.
That's a great point. One of the things I want to tap into for a second that you just mentioned was just, I've noticed with you and a lot of the people that I've met through my dad at the summit, and then also sometimes in my groups. I recently did a Nurturing Fathers group at an addiction recovery center. And these guys had spent so much time working on themselves that they were super connected with their emotions. And so it almost seemed like they were on like a higher level. And I feel the same way with some of the gentlemen that I meet with Dad. And I feel the same with you. And it's because I think that you've worked on it over the years. It's almost like working on a muscle, right? Like you're training yourself to be more connected to your emotions. For the guys that are listening out there that, like myself, who don't really feel like we've gotten to that level yet, what are some things that you think that we can do to tap into our full range of emotions more than just the things that we're so accustomed to, like anger and excitement at football games, which, like you said, is so comfortable and easy. I can high five my son and jump all around crazy when the Dolphins score a touchdown. But when it comes to, something else in the common world, it becomes much more awkward.
I think in some ways, my desire to practice social work is a reflection of my, kind of misplaced mysticism. I really love looking at the psychology of human beings. And again, the family system is where we learn so many things about lessons about life and education and money and love and work and all those things. And I think being able to have some, as you guys know, that many men come into our programs with deep levels of trauma. I know you've done work in prisons and addiction centers and just even doing work in the community. Men are coming with all this, many times undiagnosed, unrecognized trauma from things that have happened earlier in their lives. And it's understandable that people don't often want to look at that because it hurts. And the whole idea about, experiencing pain, like we don't want to go there. So I think having some ritualized mechanism that people can use in their lives, groups are great, individual therapy is great. And in addition to that, I think people need some ritual in their own lives that helps them get in touch with themselves. For me, I know it's regular meditation. There's a whole kind of mindfulness movement going on here now where people are trying to get more, in touch with their feelings and live in the present moment. And that's really important, but it's hard to maintain that level of awareness if you don't have some repository of peace to draw from. I think just having like a daily practice, whether it's running, whether it's going to the gym, whether it's meditating, whether it's swimming, but it's some place where you can get, kind of silent and reflective and not only think about, where you are in your life now, but a little bit of visioning of where you want to go and where you came from and bring that back to the present moment so you can really recognize that the point of power is in the present moment.
Right. And, I have two mechanisms in my own life that have served that purpose that come to mind. One is being part of a men's group, which is now in its 32nd year, essentially the same group of guys. And that gives us the opportunity to talk about those very things that we don't often talk about together. I mean, we're on the sports field, which is great and it's fun, different conversations, different energy. But when we sit in that circle, just as soon as we begin the group, the feeling is this is a safe place. I can say anything I need to or want to, and it's going to be treated with love and compassion and helpfulness. So we are able to have those conversations and bring out those other parts of ourselves that we all fear. Like you said, the fear of our kids being involved in a school shooting, the fear of not having enough money when we retire. And it's just human stuff as well as men and father stuff. So that gives us a place at least every week or two when that group meets. Now, I also want to say that the Nurturing Fathers program that sits as a group for 2.5 hours a week for 13 weeks gives men that same opportunity, although we don't call it a men's group. But it does give men the same opportunity of sitting in a circle together, as you mentioned, Haji, and talking about those subjects that the Nurturing Fathers program prescribes, and it just may be on the men's minds. The other practice that I have personally is a practice of tenderness. And what I mean by that is the part of me that is hard and has a barrier around and protective that we as so many men have. The other side of that is to make that barrier a little softer and a little more permeable, so we let more of the world in. We let the feeling in, we let the pain of the world in, we let the pain of our children in. So if my son falls down and cuts his finger, it's not like, well, suck it in, man up, don't cry. It's like, oh, sweetie, what happened here? That must hurt. Let me take care of it. But the practice of tenderness, to actually let more feeling in. When you hear a sad song, when you see a sad movie, when your wife is talking in a female and nurturing and tender way, to actually try and meet her there. So it's a practice for me to actually let more of the pain of the world, or even the pain of my family, and the tenderness in. And I think, as with your meditation, the more we practice it, the more we find we can experience it. What results from that, I think, and I hope, is letting a little more tenderness in ourselves in our life, is more of a sense of empathy for others, compassion for others, and ultimately kindness and loving kindness for others. Because when we soften and let more of that pain in, the natural response is caring and extending ourselves out for that. For all that being said, I have one more area, Haji, I'd like you to speak a little bit to, and that is when fathers go out in the world, and there's a large group of men who are single fathers. For whatever reason, the mom's not available and they're taking this on by themselves. Or even if they go to a doctor's office with their wife, they are often treated and met differently. The father is seen more as, at best, a secondary parent, at worst, possibly incompetent, assumed that maybe he's not as good a parent as the mom. We see that in our courts, and I think all that is improving, hopefully for the work that we've done, and we've got a long way to go. But we see it in our courts, where they were used to be very hesitant to give fathers custody. We see it in Department of Children and Families. They're very hesitant to give father custody. Some fathers have mentioned they see it in the doctor's office, where the doctor will talk exclusively, or nurse talk exclusively to the mom as if the father's not there. And they're sitting there together. So share with us a little bit your understanding of that, Haji, and where you've seen some of that.
Sure. And then I want to come back and ask you a question, Mark, about your men's group, because I think that is a really special place in the world. And I have a question that I want to bring up around that. But there was one program that I worked with that actually had two categories for parents that were involved in this program. One was primary parent, and the other was secondary parent. And guess who usually became the secondary parent?
All right.
We looked at that as an organization, and the linguistics around that and how that was belittling and how it didn't work. And through a long, process, came up with this designation of other parent, which I'm not sure it's much better, but it was a change at least. And people were recognizing that that person has value. As we think about our culture, the Nurturing Fathers movement and the women's movement that preceded it were so impactful, because it helped us to gain more flexibility in the roles that we, traditionally played in the family and in greater society. So we're coming from a place where generation upon generation, if not millennia upon millennia, women have been the primary caretaker in the home. Women are the ones who give birth, who breastfeed. And there's a certain biological component to this, which is just natural and normal and healthy. All that being said, there's a joy and a pleasure to connecting with very young children, with infants and toddlers. When I was born in 1962, it was illegal for my father to be in the delivery room when I was born. It was against hospital policy, and you have a man trying to argue, force his way into the delivery room. That's like a code red, and security gets called and all that. So I say, effectively it was illegal for him to be there when I was born. Now it's more common than not for men to be present when their children are born. And if you talk to any guy who was present at the birth of his child. I can think about it now, being there when both my children were born, and it still brings up goosebumps. So for us being present from the birth and thinking about all the things that we can do to help this child, grow into a successful adult. It's amazing that so many of those tasks were just relegated to as women's work before, and that men's work was just outside the home. So as the genders began to look at their roles more creatively and what we could do differently, men began to do more of these things, like show up for school meetings and for doctor's visits and for doing homework and bath time at night and all these places that, if you want to really be honest and look at it, that many men in very recent generations weren't doing all these things. So I think that we have not, as a society, it's unfortunate, but the reality is not everybody's got this message. Not all pediatricians are aware that there are a lot of primary dads who are, stay-at-home dads, or who are almost equal caretakers, or just doing maybe a little bit less than mom, because these old habits sort of die hard. If you grew up in a family where mom was doing most of the work in the home, and even if mom worked outside the home, she was still doing most of the parenting, that may not totally switch even in one generation. But we're certainly seeing a move towards more equitable parenting. And the fact that everybody hasn't got the memo yet, I think it's a time lag. And that for men, just like women have to, be more assertive in the workplace to get their voices heard, men may need to be more assertive in the doctor's office or in school meetings. And they need to speak up and say, like, oh, yeah, I do homework with my child every night, or, 3 or 4 nights of the week. What can I do, teacher? Talk to me as well. Or doctor, I give medicine as well. I'm doing this, like, talk to me. And we need to recognize that this is a cultural norm that's changing, and that for the dads who are going to these visits, who are meeting with social service and education and pediatrics, that we are in the cutting edge. And it's not always easy to be in the cutting edge, but it's really exciting to be out here. And the thing I want to talk about was the men's group, and that sometimes we need other men that can empathize and understand, because maybe, women don't get it, how hard it is. And they're like, oh, well, the nurse, like she felt your wife or girlfriend may have felt heard and seen in the doctor's office, and she might not even understand why you didn't feel heard. But maybe your guy buddy will, your male friend will, your brother across the street will. And so having those kind of conversations with other, men that can understand and appreciate that, which is why, again, the Nurturing Fathers program and other kinds of men's groups are really special.
Yeah, it provides the support which is desperately needed to protect the men from just feeling very alone and isolated. Sometimes like I'm the only guy on the planet who feels like this. No, there are legions of men who feel like this, just like as women were coming to power and sat in women's consciousness raising groups to help each other. That movement succeeded. It has changed the world and changed our country. And hopefully we, as you're saying, Haji, as men can be doing the same thing, to have at least a couple of friends, if not a formal group. And the Nurturing Fathers does serve, beside an educational forum, as a formal group for talking exactly in the way that you described. There have been times that men have said to me that in a doctor's office, they have a parent signature, one line that mom signs, and the guy has to ask, could I sign the form as well? And they have to draw a second line for the father to sign, or the social worker from Department of Children and Families at home comes in with only one line to sign. And so, those are just symbolic aspects of the father needs to take his rightful place. And it's a major movement in our society, but as you say, it's such a large change that it's slow and will take time. But I must say that for those of us who have been in this work, Haji, you in the mainstream, Corey right now, as well as myself, it is such powerful and delightful and really blessed work to be able to do this kind of thing and be part of it. And for the men who are on the path, I think that they feel so good about themselves to have expanded and grown in these ways, and all of a sudden experience this tenderness for an infant and be able to comfortably hold the infant and take care of their needs and so on. I think it's very wonderful to see how the men blossom.
Thanks for listening to the Nurturing Fathers podcast. Have questions or comments? Join the conversation at facebook.com/nurturingfathers or email us at nurturingfathers@gmail.com.